To make your presentation.
Okay, great. I'm going to start off firstly by just outlining our concerns and position. Then I'm going to go into some case examples of how hate speech can be wrongly used and people can be accused of hate speech who are in fact not guilty at all. And I'll give some case examples. And while I'm doing that, I would like everybody who's listening to think about whether you might one day be wrongly accused of hate speech under this legislation. The risk is with this proposal to criminalize hate speech with a very broad definition that people might be made to be afraid to speak up with their opinions when in fact it's not hate speech at all. Now, just to introduce the Association of Christian Media, it's a group of 70 organizations, which includes about 30 community radio stations, some television and magazines. And in this media, there are many different varying opinions that are expressed, and they would also make space for people who hold opposite viewpoints to even the radio station themselves to facilitate public debate. And this, there can be examples of this that I'll mention in future, but this debate might be suppressed by the risk that somebody might be accused of hate speech. Now, to go firstly into the case examples, and I'm going to be giving some slides. This is an example. These are current case examples. This is not stuff that happened a long time ago. This is a person who is a feminist activist in England who put up a billboard giving the dictionary definition of a woman. And she was then accused of hate speech. She was interrogated by the police, and the billboard company, accepting this allegation, took down all of her billboards. So she was then silenced from giving that opinion. Now, this is not a particularly Christian opinion, but we have entirely opposite opinions which are also being silenced. Now, we have a case which happened in Durban earlier this year where a street evangelist, and on your right is a picture of him from the screenshot of where he was accused, was preaching in the street, and somebody took a social media video of him and posted it on the internet where he was trying to persuade other Indians to convert from Hinduism to Christianity. He argued that Jesus was greater than the Hindu gods. He was then accused of saying that, wrongly accused of saying that Christians were better than Hindus, and then that was considered to be hate speech. And so the Hindu interest group sued him for R1 million damages. He was forced to expend money and stress on a court case. Thankfully, the thing was settled out of court after it had gone to court. But this then would really put a damper and a chilling effect on people expressing those opinions, which I think are part of our fair religious discussion. Now, here's one that's, I think, closer to home, which is a Finnish MP, Pavi Ransanen, who is currently on trial for criminal hate speech for posting a social media post of a Bible verse. I put the English translation in the middle. There's a picture of her there, and she, on the right-hand side, is the actual screenshot of what she posted, just so you can see it's the same. But she was entering into a social media debate, but then the national prosecutor decided to prosecute the member of parliament, and this has now been ongoing for about 6 months. They're wanting to fine her 6 months of salary and possibly even a prison sentence for something that to me is not hate speech at all. That is just a Bible verse. But they would like to, certain interest groups who've got political power would like to shut down any kind of religious debate on these issues. So this is something really that's we haven't seen in Europe maybe since the fascist era of the Second World War. but is now coming back, where people are really being punished for their what they are saying. Just another example that happened just very recently is an American politician who is a biological male who presents himself as a female. An American magazine nominated him as Woman of the Year, and another satirical website nominated them then as Man of the Year, and this was then accused of hate speech. We've had other examples that I would also many other examples that I've experienced, but I've just put these examples just so that we can see that these issues are not just the genuine hate speech that where people are willfully intending to harm other people. Now, we've got a situation where there is a raft of legislation that is in process at the moment. Some of it's been passed and some of it's in the pipeline, which, if all of this was passed as it is at the moment, would drastically reduce the opportunity for free speech in this country, and I think push it closer to a situation like China or Russia or Saudi Arabia, where you need to say the things only that are aligned with the people in power, and to try and protect yourself against those risks. And this would drastically cut down community radio, freedom of the press, if all of these things were passed as is. Now, we would argue that this hate speech legislation is unnecessary, because there is other existing multiple pieces of legislation that you can use to deal with hate speech. We've got the Incitement Act, Criminal Injurer, Harassment Act, the Equality Act, defamation law, the underlying criminal acts of if somebody commits murder or violence, there are laws that punish that. There are codes of conducts. We have the Film and Publication Bill. So there are many vehicles to prosecute these things, but this is, I believe, similar to a nuclear attack, where you can really destroy both hate speech and legitimate speech at the same time, and we don't want that. I also believe that this proposal as it stands is not constitutional, because, and that's been confirmed by the recent Kolani judgment. The very subtle changes in wording that can have an enormous impact in terms of what happens on the ground. And I think that there are four basic words that are important that we have to see here, but the way that those words are combined together into law can make a huge difference as to whether legitimate speech is captured or whether legitimate speech is not captured. So I'm going to go through very quickly just the meaning of some of those words and how it makes a difference how you put them together. The first is advocacy. That infers an intention and usually an ongoing campaign to push a particular viewpoint. That is not an accidental statement. The second thing is hatred. That is something which is not just an expression of an opinion, but something that has malice. Then there is incitement to cause harm, which is trying to motivate other people to harm other people. And normally the assumption is that that would be physical harm, and that can be very dangerous if somebody is inciting other people to harm other people. Then there is the question of harm, which is broader, because that can be the harm that somebody perceives the words do to them. So now the danger there is that simply because somebody is offended by what is said, they can say, well, I'm being psychologically harmed by that. And then that becomes very dangerous. Now, if that is criminally prosecuted, then people are going to be much more careful about what they are going to say, and that can shut down real debate. But having said these four issues, the question is how they are combined together. And Section 4.1a in this hate speech bill is saying that you need the first one, advocacy, hatred, or you need incitement to cause harm. Now, the Kolani judgment said you need both. in order to make it an offense just as a civil offense, but this is a criminal offense, so the threshold should be narrower, and so it has to be an and, not an or, if one's going to have that. Now, there are then in section 4.2 a number of exceptions where there's a positive attempt to open the door for religious scientific statements, which would reduce the harm that this bill would do and reduce the risk. But they then have qualifiers on each of those, such as, for example, they would say, to the extent that such interpretation of proselytization does not advocate hatred that constitutes incitement to cause harm. So the thing is now, if you put an and at the beginning there, that statement becomes completely meaningless and unnecessary, except to water down what has already been said. So I would say the first option is to not pass this bill, remove it altogether. But if one is going to have this bill, then we must make the 4.1 A into an and we must also remove this exception to the extent, because it's unnecessary and it would be then a circular reference and leave the judge confused as to what is meant here. So, and that I would say also in terms of 2A, which is artistic creativity. Now, the other issue which I would just raise, which is concerning, is that a number of presenters have referenced the Yoga Carta principles as international law, which Parliament is somehow obliged to follow. Now, firstly, that is not international law. Yoga Carta was simply an NGO conference of like-minded NGOs who got together and had a discussion. It has no status at the United Nations, neither has it been ratified by the South African Parliament. And so that is entirely misleading to say that South Africa must now abide by that. There's also multiple things in international law which are balancing to this whole issue of hate crimes. There's statements protecting the family, there's statements protecting free speech. And if you take these all in a balanced way, you come out with something that is very similar to what we already have in the definition of unprotected speech in the Constitution, section 16. And that is what we would support as a correct definition of hate speech, and not go further than that. Then there's also the categories of all the different sort of victim categories which can be classified as hate speech. I would say that this is very confusing, having two lists in the same bill and a different list in the Constitution, and it's not clear always why one thing is in one list and not in another list. I would argue stick with the list that is in the Constitution, that was thought through very carefully, and it's based on international precedent. The difficulty with making a broad list, and I was shuddered to hear the suggestion of an open-ended list, which I would concur with the Department of Justice is not in the principle of legality, is that anybody who has a particular viewpoint can then start to frame themselves as a victim and say, well, I'm being victimized by the people who have an opposite opinion, when it's not hate speech at all, and then try and bring in the threats of criminal sanctions. And without this thing going to court, most people, 9 out of 10 people given a threat, are going to back down without the need for the thing to go to court. It's an enormous cost and emotional toll to actually go through with a court process, and 9 out of 10 people will just back down. This will have a chilling effect on free speech. So we would argue this is just entirely unnecessary. This opening up with all these other categories as an experiment that can open the door for every NGO that has a particular interest to attack some other group that it doesn't agree with and accuse them of hate speech. And the most aggressive people are going to win in this fight. So we would argue that this this needs to be preferably scrapped altogether. But if it is kept, then we need to put in that and instead of an or in section 4.1, and then in section 4.2, the qualifiers need to be removed. I've also heard a senior politician interpret this in such a way as the religious exception would only apply to things said in church. Now that I don't agree with as a correct interpretation of this thing, because it talks about proselytization, but the very fact that he's suggesting that means that he could threaten somebody, they could be prosecuted, and then they have to go through 5 years of court process and appeals before finally the Constitutional Court says, no, that was a wrong interpretation by the Department of Justice. Meanwhile, R1 million being expended if the person has the money, but if he doesn't have the money, then he's can be wrongfully found guilty or intimidated. So I think that the bill as it is at the moment is very dangerous, and it's also concerning this talk about sensitivity training that is many times being used in other countries and other places and in our universities as an attempt to force people to change their opinions. And I can give case examples that have happened just recently in our local universities. People have been threatened with their careers, and if they don't retract opinions, say, for example, somebody expressed an opinion that a man should be head of the household, and he's then accused of hate speech against women, which clearly he wasn't, but that was interpreted. Okay, so so my call is either scrap this bill altogether or tighten it up with a shorter list in line with the Constitution and much narrower definition of what is hate speech. But I don't see a need for this at all, and I think it can have a very detrimental effect on public debate. Another case example, I had participated in a radio debate against a person who was arguing that the Bible promotes racism and that black people are inferior. That was hosted on an Association of Christian Media statement. It's still on the internet if you want to listen to it. But we had a successful debate, and we felt that was helpful in proving that point. But with this legislation, just the person who communicates these views and giving space for debate then could be prosecuted, not only the person who says it. And that, to me, is unhealthy. And we should try and have debate open as much as possible, short of actual real incitement to violence or harm, which is something which is already covered by other legislation. So maybe we can go to questions.